All right, thank you and good afternoon. I am Sarah Elliott with Family Planning Elevated, and I am so delighted to welcome you to the third webinar in our contraceptive education series. Some of you may be familiar with Family Planning Elevated, but for those of you who aren't, we are a statewide contraceptive initiative that's housed at the University of Utah. We work with community members, policymakers, and clinics around the state with the goal of making contraceptives accessible to all Utahns who want them. For more information, you can head over to our brand new website, myfpe.org. Today, Dr. David Turok will present an update on emergency contraception for the pandemic and beyond. This is a topic that, as the title suggests, is important by its own right during non-corona times, but particularly so during this pandemic when clients face additional barriers to accessing a routine method of contraception and need a backup plan for preventing pregnancy. Before we get started, I would like to ask everyone to take a brief survey. If you've already received the link we sent by email and you've taken it already, thank you. If you haven't taken it, no problem. We're going to let you take it right now. You'll see the link on your screen, which you can type into your browser, and we've also pasted it into the chat box. Or if you have a smartphone handy, you can open up the camera app and hover it over the QR code on the screen, and the survey will open up directly. We will take the next few minutes to allow you to go ahead and answer the 5 questions in the survey. Don't worry if you don't know the answers. You'll have an opportunity to answer them again in our post survey after we hear from Dr. Turok. So we'll go ahead and just give this a few minutes and appreciate your help in completing this survey. All right, thank you. And if you still need to complete that survey, the link will still be in the chat box. Feel free to use that. Before we get ready to start, just a few housekeeping items before I pass over to Dr. Turok. Everyone is currently muted, but we do encourage your participation. You can use the chat function, the reactions buttons, and annotations if you're feeling creative. If you don't know what annotations are, you can try them out. It's a way to anonymously enter text or add reactions onto the screen. You can access them in your menu bar under More Options. Once we get to the end, there'll be an opportunity for questions, and you can feel free to unmute yourself at that time. At the end of today's session, I'll also review instructions for claiming CME credit for your participation today, and we will also dedicate 5 minutes at the end of the webinar to complete your post-webinar survey. Okay, let's go ahead and introduce Dr. David Turok. Dr. Turok is an experienced OBGYN, educator, and clinical researcher. Following residencies in family medicine and OBGYN, he worked for the community health centers in Salt Lake City for over 12 years. Currently, he directs the Family Planning Division at the University of Utah, where our multidisciplinary team's current focus is family planning elevated. Dr. Turak is involved in a variety of research projects, expanding contraceptive access and developing new products. He wrote the up-to-date chapter on emergency contraception, has published over 90 research articles, and serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Contraception. Dr. Turak's research and mentoring efforts at the University of Utah are supported by an NIH Mid-Career Research and Mentoring Award. Dr. Turak, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Caitlin, for putting this together. And thanks, everyone, for taking some time to talk and think about emergency contraception today. Okay. Hopefully you can all see a slide that says an update on emergency contraception for the pandemic and beyond. Thanks, Caitlin. A little positive feedback is always helpful. Well, I'm going to talk about various aspects of EC, or emergency contraception, and hopefully address some common clinical issues that occur. And if you want to talk more about some of these things, or there are things that I don't address that you want to talk about, let me know. And I'm eager to share just a smidgen of some results from a new study that we are just working on getting published, but haven't quite yet, so I can't tell you everything about it, but that'll come toward the end. So, objectives and outline. We're going to talk about copper IUD. It's the most effective method of emergency contraception. And it is kind of amazing that in this world, you can have sex and afterward use something that will dramatically reduce your chance of having pregnancy. And it turns out that biology is far from perfect, and the chance of pregnancy from a single episode of intercourse is actually quite low, and there are a bunch of things that we can do to make it even lower. And it turns out the copper IUD is the most effective one of them. Okay, and then ulipristal acetate, otherwise known as ELA, is the most effective oral method, the most effective pill that we can use, and it has some advantages even within and among people using the pill versus some other things. We'll talk about that. Access to emergency contraception and weight matter for oral methods. It makes a big difference for people, and we'll talk some about that. And then finally, we'll talk about the intersection of emergency contraception and quick start. And quick start, I think, is something you've probably heard about or do all the time. And way back when I was early in my medical training, the standard deal was like you started contraception on the first day of your period, regardless of what the method was. And that led to many people being essentially turned away and told, oh, you're not in that, or the first 7 days of your cycle, you have to wait for the next one. And that is some kind of paternalistic ridiculousness that medical providers perpetuated for many years. And eventually people were like, this is obscene and we can do this better. And Carolyn Westhoff is one of several people who's really put in enormous effort on this and just essentially meeting people's needs on the day that they show up. And that is very much in line with emergency contraception, and we'll talk some about that. So I think it's always good to ground discussions about contraceptive access and contraception with reproductive justice. This relatively simple, though I think very elegant and thoughtful and compassionate approach is founded on basic principles. And it uses a human rights approach toward reproduction and people who can and desire to reproduce. And this picture of a young Loretta Ross is juxtaposed with her absolutely amazing book on the topic, is always worth a nod. And I think when we think about emergency contraception, it is a place where, just like any other method of contraception, it can be used to perpetuate misogyny and eugenics and all kinds of other awful things, or it can be used to create opportunities for people to enjoy their sex lives and have access and opportunities to their life goals. So you don't need an old white guy to explain reproductive justice to you, but I do want to acknowledge it and the amazing work of women of color who founded the movement and continue to expand it today. So there are some biological facts that also impact emergency contraception. Turns out people mostly have sex for fun, sometimes without contraception for a whole host of reasons. Many methods of contraception, all of them actually, have some imperfections, and some of them necessitate having backups. And unfortunately, in this cruel world, rape and intimate partner violence happen, and they happen way too often. And it doesn't matter which of these things preceded. Sperm-egg union does not discriminate among them. It does not preferentially act on your connection with your partner or how your contraception worked or did not. If sperm and egg join, they do. They do not discriminate among these things. So emergency contraception, what is it? As I mentioned earlier, it's an amazing thing where we have the ability to prevent pregnancy after intercourse. And we have very good data to say that emergency contraception doesn't interrupt an existing pregnancy. And I'll talk a little bit about mechanism of action. It's got to be initiated in a specific time frame. And we are working with others to really push out these current limits. And I am hoping that by the next round of publication of the CDC's medical eligibility criteria and selective practice recommendations, we have data to support expansion of these things. But currently, copper IUDs are effective for emergency contraception when placed within 5 to 7 days of unprotected intercourse. And I'll show you some data that expands that. And then ulipristal acetate, or ELA, is useful also within 5 days of unprotected intercourse. Levonorgestrel, oral levonorgestrel, or Plan B, is good within 3 days. And mifepristone is it's RU486. It's the first medication used in the 2-medication regimen for medical abortion. Is available in a much smaller dose, 10 milligrams for EC versus 300 milligrams for medical abortion. And this very small dose of mifepristone is equally effective to oral LNG, but it's only available in, I believe, 4 countries currently, and one of those is China, so it's a large population. And actually, just 1 week ago, there was an article published online in Contraception by Maria Rodriguez and an old colleague of hers at the WHO about the lack of access of mifepristone for EC. Interesting reading if you're like way into this. Okay, so it's worthwhile talking about the fertile window. The fertile window is the actual period, the component of the menstrual cycle where sperm-egg union can actually occur. And it's based on some physiology, which is also worth reviewing. And I think nearly all people who have some medical training cringe a little bit at this image. It works it challenges, I think, our brains in a unique way. And basically what this diagram, this multi-level, multi-tier diagram is showing us is action at the ovary, body temperature, and then the pituitary, the ovary, and the uterus, the endometrial lining, that changes through the menstrual cycle. So from day 0 to this theoretical ideal of 28 days. And it turns out that the human experience has very little limitation of the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. These last 14 days. So if you can predict, if you are the kind of person who has a regular cycle, and you can predict when you expect your next menses to occur, 14 days prior to that, quite reliably, ovulation occurs. It turns out that humans have a very broad range of the follicular phase, that earlier part, and that's where nearly all of the variation in menstrual cycle length comes from. So if we know and can predict the ovulation day, we know that sperm survive 5 or 6 days at the longest, and amazingly, the egg survives 1 day post-ovulation. This is the only element, I believe, of the human experience where the male component can hang and wait and exercise or demonstrate some patience, I guess you could call that, more so than the female component. Okay, and then here is another schematic from a very different point of view, but if you think about emergency contraception targets, follicular maturation in the ovary, follicular rupture at the ovary, ovum transport, the egg moving from the ovary to the tube, sperm function, and fertilization followed by endometrial receptivity, different methods of emergency contraception can target all of those things. So let's say intercourse has occurred and sperm that were deposited very close to the cervix, millions of them, very few, hundreds or less, will actually get to the place in the fallopian tube where they can join with an egg. And let's say that occurs at a time that is close to or within 5 days of ovulation. Even if that is, sperm can be quiescent for quite some time, but upon ovulation, there's a transition to sperm, sperm undergo capacitation, and it's essentially a reactivation. And that can, with sperm in close proximity to the egg, you can get fertilization. And then after 3 to 4 days of development and travel through the fallopian tube, implantation can occur generally on about day 6. So in thinking about that, we'll kind of link that to some thoughts about mechanism of action. And then this is just a quick reminder of something that I had just said, but basically on the y-axis here, we have the presence of millions, 250 million sperm that come out in the average ejaculation. And you'll see that the drop-off is rather precipitous. And by the time sperm hit the cervix, there's really very few, proportionally very few left. And by the time it hits the sperm get to fallopian tube, like I said, there are even fewer, hundreds or less. This is kind of I think a handy little image to communicate the following. First is the duration of the fertile window. So around ovulation, it's about 6 days, from 5 days before ovulation to 1 day after. And then above this horizontal here, we see 3 different EC methods and how long they work. The progestin pill is effective for about the 3 days, 3 days prior, or can be used for 3 days until 3 days after unprotected intercourse. The antiprogestin pill or ulipristal acetate can be used for about 5. The copper IUD has a much longer duration of action post intercourse, and it can be used basically for 5 or even 7 days before, maybe even longer, as I'll suggest, and then goes out well past that point and can still be effective. So the data, we have really, I think, strong data from very well done studies on the use of the oral methods of emergency contraception. We know that oral LNG blocks the LH surge, and that is the main mechanism of action by which ovulation is prevented, and thus pregnancy is prevented with the use of oral LNG. Ulipristal acetate also blocks ovulation, but it continues and it will still have effect even after the time that the LH has begun to rise up to the peak. And that extra day probably represents at least some of the reason that UPA, ulipristal acetate, is more effective than oral LNG. The copper IUD is much more difficult to study and much more difficult, I think, to figure out. There's no hormones and it's just copper. So almost certainly it doesn't have an effect on ovulation. The way that we know copper IUDs work for people who are using them continually is the copper is toxic to sperm. And the sperm are already present, so maybe there's an element of that. Certainly it has the ability to disrupt fertilization and maybe interfere with sperm-egg interaction and sperm motility. And it also can have a post-fertilization effect, and that likely is the reason why it's so effective. Placing an IUD does not interrupt an established pregnancy, so thus it is not an abortifacient. So when to use these things? And I think here are some opportunity for us as clinicians when where we can expand availability of emergency contraception. And this is really, I think, something that can really make a difference for people, but we are using it way less than is possible. So one of the things that we can do to increase use is we can give new prescriptions for ulipristal acetate to essentially anyone who starts a new method of contraception. Less than half, and probably close to a third or a quarter of new oral contraceptive users will still be using it at a year. This stuff works great for some people, but certainly not for everybody. And lots of people have side effects that they don't like and challenges in acquiring pills at some point. And providing people with a prescription that they can use and fill even and have at home for whenever they need it is a good and reasonable thing. Obviously, people can use it after unprotected intercourse and come and seek care or go to pharmacies independently and get oral levonorgestrel, which you can get without a prescription over the counter. And there are some barriers to that, certainly. But it's also a reasonable thing for new contraceptive starters, some of whom will present in the middle of the cycle for a quick start and have reported recent unprotected intercourse. So if you want to start a method and you are an EC candidate, meaning have had unprotected intercourse in the last 5 days or even longer if you're getting a copper IUD inserted, it's certainly a reasonable thing to address at that point. And it's state law in most states to provide emergency contraception for people after sexual assault. And it just turns out it's just the right thing to do. So here's a little table that reviews the actual cycle per cycle pregnancy risk which each of the methods I mentioned several times now, copper IUD is the most effective method. And 0.1%, so if 100 people who have had unprotected intercourse, sorry, if 1,000 people who've had unprotected intercourse have a copper IUD placed, 0 or 1 will have a pregnancy, we expect. With ulipristal acetate, it's more like 1 or 2%, and that goes up slightly with oral levonorgestrel to 1.5 to 2.6. And both of these oral methods have some situations where the risk is quite a bit higher. The information that we have from copper IUD efficacy stems from this very well done systematic review that Kelly Cleland led a team to do. And they had gathered data from many different 42 studies that looked at 8 types of IUDs, mostly copper. Very few people got a Lippes loop, probably about 30. So basically 7,000 women got a copper IUD, and the pregnancy risk was basically 1 in 1,000. So we know this works, and this is from a whole bunch of different countries, a whole bunch of different studies and different clinical situations. These are strong, reproducible data. And interestingly, we followed a group of people here since the onset of COVID. Our colleague, Rebecca Simmons, has done a fabulous job of connecting with some people who were involved with us through a different study to see what their contraceptive experience was during COVID. And 62% of this group had previously used EC. And that's, data from the National Survey of Family Growth shows an increase in emergency contraception utilization over time, where more and more people are using it, 1 in 10, and now probably over 1 in 5. Most people have used oral levonorgestrel in our sample, but 8% had received a copper IUD, which is, I think, pretty remarkable. Okay, so one of these things about the Zoom is it requires your brain to concentrate for too long, and you're not with other people and you're not getting feedback. So we're gonna hit pause and take a little bit of a break. This is a picture of my son jumping between a couple of rocks in southern Utah. And at the time I asked him, and I think this is appropriate for a whole bunch of things that we do as clinicians and researchers, where you're taking a leap, you're jumping out there. And I asked my son at the time, I said, hey, is it okay if I use this picture of you in this talk I'm going to give about taking a leap to this new approach? And he's like, yeah, fine. He was 12 at the time. And his sister, who was 14, said, Dad, what's the talk about? Is the talk about vaginas? Her having some, I don't think it's pride, but at least curiosity about her parents' line of work. So she came up with this artistic variation and interpretation of that, what she thought might be a more appropriate image to share with people when talking about gynecology. Okay, so they're back to our previously scheduled programming. So these are data that are from a meta-analysis put together by Anna Glaser. And there were 2 studies that were RCTs of ulipristal acetate versus levonorgestrel. And what Dr. Glaser did is she tried to identify certain situations where it seemed that the EC efficacy of either or both of these things wasn't the same. It varied. And she found three situations. This slide just focuses on one, and that is BMI and basically weight. And this has been evaluated relative to that with not exactly the same results. But the bottom line here is, for people with low BMI, when you restricted this sample of 2,200 people, both of the drugs worked very, very well with pregnancy rates close to 1%. As BMI came up to the overweight group, ulipristal acetate maintained its efficacy, no change, but the efficacy diminished. The pregnancy rate increased for people who took oral LNG, up to 2.5%. And it almost got to 6% in the obese group, where people who had a BMI 30 or above. And there was also a rise, not nearly as much, about half, for people who were randomized to ulipristal. So the bottom line there and the clinical implications of this are for overweight and obese people who are using oral levonorgestrel, there is a bump, and then maybe even a bump so high that it might be almost no effect for women who are who have a BMI greater than or equal to 30 or a weight greater than 176. That is worth sharing with people. So if you are a heavier person and you're going to use an oral method, it is certainly worth the while to get the prescription that you need for ulipristal acetate for greater efficacy. And here are some pharmacokinetic data that support that. This is a study from a group at Columbia University led by a then family planning fellow, Piapa Pradippan, and she randomly assigned there's another component of this that's coming up, but people received normal BMI and obese BMI. People received, in this slide, oral levonorgestrel. And the smaller, the orange area under the curve, you can see looks to be about half. And that is the levels within the first 24 hours of obese people who took LNG. And basically the point is it's about half, and maybe that supports what we saw clinically from the data on the previous slide, where LNG was considerably less effective for heavier people. And then this is just a nod to the clinicaltrials.gov website. If you are ever thinking, I wonder if anyone is studying this, whatever it may be, this is a great place to look. Clinicaltrials.gov website, you can just type in the topic or the subject matter, or even the name of the researcher or the research location, and find a study that is ongoing. And this one is a nod to an ongoing NICHD Contraceptive Clinical Trials Network study that is enrolling heavier women greater than or equal to 80 kilograms and randomizing them to one of three things: either a single dose of levonorgestrel, a double dose of levonorgestrel, or ulipristal acetate. And we'll compare the efficacy among those people. Okay, this is that same graph that we saw earlier, and it's for people who received ulipristal acetate. And here you can see that the obese people with a BMI greater than or equal to 30 had the same or even maybe a higher level of ulipristal acetate, which also supports its greater efficacy. And then Allison Edelman from Oregon Health Sciences University did another small study. There were very few people in this, but basically she randomized people with a BMI greater than 30 to either a single dose of oral levonorgestrel or a double dose. And and then there was a third group, and the third group was the normal BMI people. And you can see those two lines at the top with that big downgoing orange arrow here signifies that the people who got the double dose of oral LNG had the same total levonorgestrel concentration, essentially the same pharmacokinetics as the people who had a BMI of 20 or below. And then this group also, less than 25. And then the heavier group who only got the single dose had about half the concentration. So that seems to also support this concern. And then these are the two other situations that Anna Glaser looked at, where there was a higher rate of pregnancy for both ulipristal acetate and levonorgestrel users. And they are people who had sex inside the fertile window, and again, higher for the LNG group than the ulipristal group. And then this is the group that had the highest risk of pregnancy, and those are people who had additional episodes of unprotected intercourse in the cycle. And the take home for these two bars right here is taking one dose of oral EC in a cycle protects you from one episode of unprotected intercourse. And having additional episodes requires additional action. So in summary, these last 5 slides tell us that heavier people have a higher risk of pregnancy with oral EC, especially those using oral LNG. And for that group, using oral ulipristal is definitely the better way to go. And then people who have sex inside the fertile window from 5 days before to 1 day after ovulation, and those who have additional intercourse in the same cycle all have elevated rates of pregnancy. Okay, now thinking about those 3 situations, heavier people, intercourse in the fertile window, and further intercourse in the same cycle, if you get a copper IUD inserted for emergency contraception, it doesn't care about any of those things. It works exceedingly well with a pregnancy risk rate of 0.1% in all of those situations, we believe, and have some data, but not 7,000 people's worth. And it turns out that that's probably also the case for the LNG IUD, and I will share a little bit more about that. So one thing that I have heard people ask is, can you use oral levonorgestrel as a regular method of contraception? And this systematic review from Cochrane Library tells us that, yeah, you can. It's not the most effective thing, but it does have efficacy. And for a whole bunch of people, it's a good and reasonable thing. So 22 trials with over 12,000 people. The summation on the pregnancy risk was about 5 pregnancies per 100 women years. The one and significant caveat in this is people have lots of irregular bleeding when they do this, but it is safe to use oral levonorgestrel, which is what's been studied in this, multiple times in one cycle. And this is just a nod to the American Society for Emergency Contraception. This organization has long been led by Kelly Cleland, who did that systematic review on the copper IUD. And it has all kinds of awesome information about emergency contraception. So if you ever have any questions, this is a really, really fabulous resource. Okay, this is a kind of sticky subject, and I am going to try to make a bunch of somewhat complicated studies as simple as possible to understand for the practicing clinician. And they all address the interaction between ulipristal acetate and exogenous progestogens, meaning hormones that people take to prevent ovulation. So there are 3 questions that a series of studies have addressed, and they all deal with this interaction. The first study that was done addressed the question of, does ulipristal acetate alter the onset of ovarian quiescence when combined hormonal contraception or combined pills are started after EC. So basically, if you take oral EC, ulipristal acetate, and you start combined pills right away, which is not an uncommon thing, like, does it make the pills not work in that first cycle? And the answer to that is no. The pills work. And then this next question was, do progestogens, when started with UPA, basically mess with UPA's ability to delay or prevent ovulation? And the answer to that seems to be yes. Certainly in one situation, probably in others. And then, the implications of this stuff is, should you delay starting combined oral contraceptives or others if you miss pills and take ulipristal acetate? So let's say you are using the pill regularly, and this, just imagine some other pre-COVID, but obviously this can happen during COVID as well, where you miss 3 days of the pill, and then you're like, ooh, I missed the pill, and I'm going to take Ella, and do I need to do that? And then when should I start my pills again? And so a study looked at that, and basically, if you're in that situation, just take the pills, and you probably don't need to take ulipristal. Okay, so I'm just going to very quickly go through these things, and they're here so that if you are super into this stuff, you can look look more closely at these studies. But this is the first study from Sharon Cameron, who randomized people to ulipristal acetate versus placebo at mid-cycle, and then they all started combined hormonal pills with ethinyl estradiol and oral levonorgestrel. And basically, the majority of people achieved ovarian quiescence, and it took them a little bit longer. The group that ovulated, regardless of randomization, the group that ovulated did it quickly, and then also quickly moved on to ovarian quiescence. But the bottom line was, it didn't make a difference whether you got ulipristal or you got placebo when you started pills. Okay, and then this is probably the most impactful study in this little collection here, and it was done by Vivian Brache, and what she did is, there was a somewhat complicated randomization scheme here, but the bottom line on this is, people who got ulipristal and desogestrel, it's just a progestin-only pill that's available in Europe, not available in the United States, but the people who got this combination, about half of them ovulated. The people who got ulipristal alone and a placebo, so they didn't get the oral progestogen, they didn't, one of them ovulated, so barely any. And then, as expected, in this final group, there was also some ovulation. So the bottom line on this is, there is a significant difference if you take early oral progestin-only pills, this type, again, that we don't have in the US, versus ulipristal alone. So, and then Alison Edelman essentially did a follow-up version of that with combined hormonal pills in the US, and found similar findings. And the group here is the delayed ovulation group in those who got ulipristal. So they were more likely to ovulate. Okay, and then this final group of people who missed 3 pills and then took UPA. And the bottom line on this is, so everyone in this group, in this study, got ulipristal acetate, and then after missing 3 pills at the beginning in the first week, when it has greatest effect, and then used UPA, and then got randomized to essentially starting their pills right away or delaying their start. And in the immediate restart group, nobody ovulated. In the delayed start group, some people ovulated. And the take home here is, if you are using oral contraception, even irregularly, or miss some pills at the beginning, the best thing to do is just restart right away. This doesn't tell us if you miss more than 3 days, or or if you have irregular use throughout the month, but it does help in this one particular situation. So it's not the be all end all. Okay, this is, believe it or not, a attempt to simplify this whole situation. And it comes from essentially the up-to-date article on emergency contraception, and the rather brilliant editor there, who I spoke with, and she's like, oh, our readers really like a flow diagram, and they really want to know how to use this and use it in clinical practice. I'm like, oh, this is it's a mess. And she said, don't worry about it. I will make the flow chart. All I'm asking you to do is just talk me through it, how you would do it. And basically, she made what I thought was going to be nonsense and difficult information to synthesize into, I think, something pretty useful. So one of the things that we talked about and this flow chart addresses is picking the EC method and the method of ongoing contraception. And with copper IUD, it's easy. You get it all straightforward right up front, and if you continue it, it works. For oral LNG, you get a method that you essentially don't have to mess with. Like, you can start really any other method, use a backup, or abstain for a week, and continue on. You're on your way. But it is less efficacious, especially in those 3 situations we talked about. In ulipristal acetate, the current recommendation by most groups is to hold hormones for 5 days and then start, and then use abstinence or backup. So the flow chart essentially becomes, you want an IUD, go for it. If you don't, then assess for pregnancy risk. And if you are in that group, and here's where you as a clinician can help your patients, if you're in that higher risk for pregnancy group, where you have multiple episodes or mid-cycle unprotected intercourse, you're better off with ulipristal. If you are in the lower risk group and are prioritizing ongoing contraception, then it's better and acceptable to use oral LNG. There are many other barriers and facilitators that are worth thinking about for people, and people generally decide with their feet and go to a pharmacy or supermarket and get oral LNG if they want, or they have access to a prescription for ulipristal acetate, are able to get that, and that's where we as clinicians can help. So we've learned some things about IUDs and emergency contraceptions. There's fewer pregnancies when people use copper IUDs rather than oral LNG over the course of a year. And then, we have an increasing collection of data that the copper IUD can be used at any time with a negative pregnancy test. And every time I've ever spoken about this, people have asked, well, what about the LNG IUD for EC? And pretty much the answer has always been, well, we don't really have data for that. And I'm just going to basically skip through some things and acknowledge that the CDC has come up with what I think is a pretty complicated version of when a copper IUD can be placed for EC. It could be inserted within 5 days of unprotected intercourse. But if the day of ovulation is known, then it can also be inserted 5 days after. um, if it's not more than 5 days after ovulation. So yeah, that could be simpler. And we've essentially looked a few different ways at large groups of copper IUD users and shown that those things really don't matter. And a recent article by Ivana Thompson in Contraception showed that in 134 people who had a copper IUD inserted 6 to 14 days after unprotected intercourse, so beyond the emergency contraception window, there were 0 pregnancies. Now, this is not a study of thousands or 7,000 people, but it has a confidence, the top end of the confidence interval is still within the realm of what we would consider okay for oral LNG. And these data are hard to come by. So I think this is helpful information and lets us know that if your patient has a negative urine pregnancy test and wants a copper IUD, regardless of what their history of intercourse is in that cycle, it's okay to place a copper IUD. And I am hopeful that the CDC will review data from this study and others to make a similar conclusion and thus change clinical guidelines. And then one thing that we did that happened in the discussion section of this paper is we also added in data from 2 other studies, smaller studies that looked at essentially at the same thing and were able to contribute data. And together, collectively, from these 3 studies, it's 250 people who had that exposure, 0 pregnancies. Top end of the 97.5 confidence interval is 1.5%. Similar information with the LNG IUD, where that same exposure for 187 people yielded 1 pregnancy. So not quite as good probably as copper, but pretty close. And then the rapid emergency contraception study is the one I was just alluding to that we are working on publishing and disseminating. But bottom line on this, and this is available on clinicaltrials.gov, is we randomized emergency contraception users to either the copper or levonorgestrel IUD. The primary outcome was non-inferiority, essentially, so no difference in pregnancy rates based on a 2.5% difference between these 2. And we had 655 people who completed this, and there was 1 pregnancy. So we know that from that, both work. More to come, plenty more. Okay, so some take homes here. Offer EC every time you address contraception. Please, please, your patients will certainly appreciate that. Give samples of UPA or oral levonorgestrel, and FPE covers this. So if you are from an FPE clinical site, we will reimburse you for distributing ulipristal or oral LNG. So do not, cost does not need to be a barrier for people. And then don't withhold the copper or levonorgestrel IUD if recent unprotected intercourse. Of course, this is a clinical decision and you may await the guideline information, but we have an increasing collection of data. In the article about the LNG IUD with unprotected intercourse 6 to 14 days prior to IUD placement is in press at the Green Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And then please remind people oral LNG for emergency contraception is over the counter, and provide ulipristal acetate prescriptions and encourage people to fill it so that they have it on hand. There's nothing dangerous about people using it and passing it on to somebody else who needs it as well. So I think we'll wrap it up there, and if people have questions or want to chat, and I'm happy to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Turak. And I definitely encourage everyone to put any questions you have into the chat box here and we can address them. I believe we did have a question, and I apologize, we moved a little bit past it, but I believe it was from slide 21 from Sarah, who asked, does the timing of the additional intercourse matter?
Sarah, that is a great question. And we do not have for methods of oral EC, we don't have, or they did not publish the specific data about the timing. So, essentially once menses has occurred, and for most people who take oral EC, the onset of the next cycle is delayed a few days. But once menstruation occurs, then, the clock is reset. So it's I think nearly all of these people had intercourse pretty close again to that time where ovulation happened, or where they took oral EC. So we don't have specific data. We do have some specific data on the copper IUD, and one of an early study that we did to look at that looked at this collection of almost 1,900 copper IUD EC users from China, and we basically were able to get access to their original data to look at cycle days. And for that group, the intercourse timing before did not matter, but we didn't have information about intercourse after. For this upcoming rapid EC study, we have data for after IUD placement for people who got the LNG and the copper IUD. It's not perfect, but it's pretty helpful because we have data on over 300 people randomized to each intervention who had, we have some information about whether they had additional intercourse, and they had very low rates of pregnancy. Hopefully that's.
Thank you. We had Nina say thank you so much for this great presentation. Would you mind repeating what the dosage is of Miffy when used as an EC?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry. It's 10 milligrams versus 300 milligrams for when it's used for medical abortion.
Great. Could you say more about offering double dose of LNG EC pills for overweight patients? Is this something that is now being done and recommended for those patients if UPA is not available or IUD is not desired?
Yeah, awesome question. And I would say as a clinician, if, or as a, EC user, if I were in that situation and could do it, I probably would. It's kind of cost prohibitive in that, most insurances don't cover this now. And a single dose is in the neighborhood of $40. So a double dose is quite expensive. But it, again, and that's why this 3-arm RCT is ongoing, that the NICHD Contraceptive Clinical Trials Network is doing. So one thing to do is if you are in Salt Lake, Planned Parenthood is one of the sites for this, and you can refer patients to that study so that they potentially could get randomized to the double dose, but not a guarantee. And obviously, if they wanted to take the double dose on their own, they could do that. One other important thing that I did not mention is access to ulipristal has been more challenging as of late because the US distributor is changing. And that will not be, I'm sure, perfect, and there may be a gap in availability. But the change is literally happening right now.
Great, and we did get a couple more questions and a comment here that's not a question, but as a note from Jennifer Robinson, who has said in New Mexico, using GoodRx coupons with prescribed LNG EC makes it as cheap as $10 per tab. So comment there.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing.
And the next question was, did the rapid EC study also look at the weight? Does it work as well across BMI ranges?
Yeah, yes.
Great. What about using multiple COCPs as EC?
Yeah, that is an effective alternative. It's just not as effective as the methods we talked about, and has more side effects because you end up taking a bunch of estrogen, generally in the neighborhood of 100 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol. And it's certainly an option if none of these other things are available, and better, certainly, and better than nothing. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. And last one so far is, what can you tell us about the use of the implant for EC?
Awesome question. We are, that is our next area of interest. And my colleague, Lori Garon, is looking at that. And there's a clinicaltrials.gov webpage addressing her forthcoming study that'll randomize people to getting ulipristal plus the implant or just the implant, to see if there's an interaction there. And the implant only arm may give us information about whether the implant by itself works. But bottom line on that is, if you have a patient today or tomorrow who wants an implant and has had recent unprotected intercourse, the best and safest thing to do is give them oral LNG and place the implant if you think they're relatively low risk for the recent unprotected intercourse, or have them take oral ulipristal and then wait for 5 days and then do the implant insertion. You could also wait 5 days from the time of unprotected intercourse, because sperm, as long as people are not having additional episodes of intercourse, if we know sperm are only going to last 5 days, once it's been 5 days since the last episode, then that's how long you could wait to place the implant, because you're not at risk beyond that.
Great. Thank you so much to Dr. Turok for this wonderful presentation. I know we've reached the end of our time with everyone here. I am going to bring up the screen again to be able to give you some input on CME credit.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Turok. All right, for all of you with us, we do have one CME credit available for this webinar. We will email you the code and instructions for claiming your credit once you have completed your post-webinar survey. If you've set up a CME profile with the U of U before, the process is very simple. You just call the phone number and enter your event code. If you haven't set up a CME profile with the U before, you'll be asked to complete a brief form before claiming your credit. The one thing we do want to really emphasize is that the CME credit must be claimed before midnight tonight. If you try to enter in the code tomorrow, it will not work. So the instruction guide that we'll be sending you should answer most of your questions, but don't hesitate to email us if you need any assistance. And lastly, we're going to leave the webinar open here for a little bit and ask that you complete our post-webinar survey. Just like the pre-survey, there are 3 different ways to get there. You can type the URL into your browser directly. You can click the link in the chat box or hover your smartphone camera over the QR code. The survey will ask if the webinar has taken place yet. Please be sure to answer yes so that the appropriate questions appear for you. And it has been an absolute pleasure hosting for you today. We hope you'll join us monthly for new topics in our webinar series. Next month, we welcome Dr. Rebecca Simmons to present on fertility awareness-based methods of contraception. Thank you all, and take good care of yourselves. And with that, I'll leave you to the survey.